There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel to talk about that. Jeff Moon serves as the assistant to the U.S. Trade Representative for China during the Obama administration. He's currently an international consultant. And Mary Lovely focuses on international trade and investments as an economics professor at the faculty scholar at the Syracuse University in upstate New York. And Zhang is the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for Shanghai Wenhui Daily. And Gong, no stranger to this show, is the economics professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. John, I've got to go to you in Beijing first because we've heard a lot of the U.S. side. There was a briefing just a short while ago with the U.S. Trade Representative and U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin accusing China of backsliding at the last minute. Big questions about what and how these talks are going to go forward. What's the message from Beijing?
Well, I think so far the only statement coming from the spokesman for the foreign ministry, and based on my reading, I think there is still hope this deal will be reached because China is still going to send that 100-member delegation to Washington D.C. Towards the latter part of this week, and also more importantly, I think Vice Premier Liu He is also going. So I think there's hope for that. And I think based on the information that is not widely discussed here in China in the press, that means that China is really going to that negotiation very seriously. Otherwise, it would have accused the United States of this and that. The fact that it's pretty, the press here is pretty taciturn on this issue means that China is really going to negotiate. And also in terms of the theory behind what's actually happening here. Of course, we have heard the U.S. side, an hour ago, Washington Post, for example, put out an article accusing China is trying to renegotiate or renegade on some of the terms. And I'm just wondering, what's the real fact here? Is this because this agreement of really, the terms of the agreement, or maybe about the Chinese translation version of this? So the idea of reneging on these terms have to be discussed in more detail, and we have to expect what's the real fact here.
John, just a quick follow-up before I go to the rest of our panel. We've heard a lot about U.S. demands. What are the Chinese red lines here, and also needs from the U.S. side to sign off on this deal?
Well, I think overall, China is ready to make some commitments seriously regarding opening up the economy, regarding these structural issues here. In terms of the real red line, and we have to keep in mind there's also some political pressure on the delegation. Just as in the United States, there are actually a considerable number of people who don't want to have this deal here. I think there are people in the United States also don't want to have this deal here, including some people around President Donald Trump in the administration. And I think the same situation here in China as well. So there's political pressure on the delegation as well. And I think there might be some agreement regarding what's actually being committed here, or what should be committed here. And that might also be a reason that China is reportedly trying to renegotiate some of the wordings, I guess, in this 150-page document.
Yeah, it all comes down to Thursday. Thanks, John. Let's bring in Jeff Moon, because you're used to burning the midnight oil at the USTR for all these negotiations. We saw Donald Trump's tweets there when Owen relayed them. I just want to bring up the first one. It's a very long one, but essentially, it's a complete 180 from where the US president was just a couple of weeks ago. Is this a negotiating tactic? Is this art of the deal 2.0, or is this someone's got in his ear and the hawks are winning out over the doves? We've seen big divisions in the US negotiating team.
Well, the negotiations are completely non-transparent, so we have to speculate on what the sticking point is. Lighthizer said that China has reneged on the language, so let's just
assume, the talks, the US
let's assume that for the sake of argument here. And if that's the case, you're exactly right. Trump has torn a page out of the art of the deal in this case. He's got a sticking point in the negotiations, so he has launched a surprise, put everyone off guard. He's threatening catastrophic consequences, and he's hoping that this will give him leverage to move forward in the deal. I think that the Chinese are coming here because they realize they are about to get a very favorable deal. According to what's out there in the press, they are on the verge of getting a deal that will involve purchases but not require them to make any structural changes or any changes to the factors that disadvantage foreigners in China. So they would be crazy not to come and try to take that deal, and that's why Liu He is going to be here. I think he's going to make a robust offer, and I'll even go a step further. I will bet you that we do not get the increase in tariffs on Friday.
Well, I mean, it's only Thursday. Well, you know, I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I might bet with you. But anyway, Mary Lovely, I want to bring you in here. Do you agree? Do you think this is last-minute positioning? There has been a back and forth between Washington and Beijing, especially over whether Chinese recent moves, for example, the foreign investment law and other moves to try and mollify, at least visibly, what the US has been asking for, are enough in terms of the US and monitoring and enforcement. Where do you stand?
Well, I agree with Jeff. I think we will see a deal. As he stated, the negotiations are non-transparent, so we don't really know how big a sticking point this is. But I still believe that both of the main actors, President Xi, President Trump, want this deal, and that this deal will eventually be sealed. I think President Trump, with his tweet, did surprise everyone and perhaps gained some leverage, but he also put himself into a corner because I don't think he wants to pull this trigger, not the near-term one of raising the tariffs from 10% to 25%. I think that would be viewed very negatively by American businesses, nor do I think he wants to go all the way of putting tariffs on the rest of the basket, which would be felt very strongly by American consumers. None of this mentions, of course, retaliation by the Chinese, who have shown themselves to be quite capable of inflicting pain.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, I just read a statistic that said the US exported more soybeans to the Netherlands last month than to China, which is quite incredible. Song, I want to bring you in here. And can we bring up that first tweet again from US President Trump? Because behind the sort of threatening language, some economic assumptions about tariffs. And essentially, he's called himself tariff man.
Yes.
And he thinks the US is making a lot of money out of tariffs. As we know, it's complicated, but essentially importers pay it, US costs passed on to US consumers. He's been told time and time again this, but chooses not to do that. Why do you think he's taking this negotiating stance? And do you think it works?
I mean, his negotiation practice. I think to some extent it works, especially when Liu He and Mnuchin Lighthizer were talking. I think basically China is feeling that it is worse for China to have a trade deal with the United States because our general economic and trade relationship is by far the most important thing for China. And I would say, actually, President Trump and President Xi are sharing a lot of common interest in these things. So I think if you look at what President Xi has been talking about, he's talking about a structural reform. He's talking about opening up. He's talking about importing more foreign goods to China. I think that basically reacts to what President Trump and the United States have been talking about. So I think these trade talks is fundamentally benefiting the two countries, and his tactics has been working.
John, in Beijing, so I was there at the two sessions. In fact, I saw you on our shows and we talked. And of course, the big highlight for internationally was the foreign investment law that was passed at the end of that session. We've seen other promises about opening the financial sector, for example, in China. Are the US getting the reforms they want even without the hard negotiating that we've been seeing from these trade teams?
Yes, I think some of these things, some of these reforms are indeed in the long-term interests of China. And I think the government is already ready to make these changes regardless of this trade negotiation. I think some of them are already planned way ahead of this trade tension started. It's just a matter of time that these things will eventually be introduced. And I think this trade tension, it just accelerate this process. Now, I also want to make a comment about why Donald Trump is resorting to this very dramatic measure, tweeting and causing all kind of a mayhem in the two stock markets, respectively, here in China and the U.S. Remember, there's also a report from CNN saying that Donald Trump allegedly said that no trade deal is final until he meets up with President Xi. So I think there's also some element about President Trump trying to, declare some personal commitment or personal contribution to this negotiation. He wants to be the man that he's going to declare victory on this. So, probably he's also doing this to try to leave the impression that it's not going well until I came in. So, that's probably another reason. And regarding this tariff thing, I think President Trump is probably under the illusion that the tariffs collected is the taxes to him. This is not a small number. We're talking about, $20, $30, $40 billion a year so far on the existing tariffs. So he probably views this as a government revenue source. This is totally wrong. I mean, this is actually being paid by American consumers, and it's just another way of taxing people.
I'm glad you said it, because I've got figures in front of me. Tariffs collected in 2018 were $49.7 billion. That's a jump of 41% from the 35.2 in 2017. Jeff Moon, is there any way you break this that tariffs actually make money?
No, and Trump knows what the truth is here. Trump is not a friend of the truth in many cases, and here is another example where he is saying things that will appeal to an audience that either doesn't know or doesn't care. So I think that it's pretty obvious that he knows what the truth is. If I could also respond to John about some of the reforms.
Yes.
I agree with him that they are in the interest of China. I would disagree that any of them are really effective. The foreign investment law is extremely vaguely worded, has a national security exception, and needs to be interpreted yet by the Congress. So we really don't even know what it's going to say. And as for sectoral openings, in no case is China saying, we are opening this sector, foreigners please come into this sector. In every case, we're talking about China giving specific licenses to a specific firm for a specific place, for a specific purpose. That is not wholesale liberalization. And we need the kind of liberalization that China enjoys in the United States. And until we get that, we will never get to the point where we will have equality and mutual benefit, which China agrees is the goal in our economic trading relations.
Mary, do you want to pick up on that? Because, obviously we're here in the US, we get a lot of the US stuff, but there is a sort of wish list for China too. And a lot of it, of course, is continued access to US technology, especially high-end semiconductors. They've been very worried about the reforms of CFIUS, which basically looks into investment from overseas, especially China. There's talk about them being blocked out of Silicon Valley acquisitions, property, etc. So this is a two-way street, right? Well, I mean, just talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think that, a listener might be confused because on the one hand, we hear John saying that these reforms will benefit the Chinese economy, which I believe is true. We also hear Jeff saying that these reforms are not going to be deep enough to be meaningful. So how are those two things true at the same time? Well, I think they're both true. On the statement that these reforms are needed in China, it is clear that there's a need for more market reform and that market reform has been stalled. And a continuing dependence on foreign investment for technology, which is, of course, crucial for China as it faces rising labor costs, rising environmental costs. On Jeff's point that this doesn't go deep enough, I agree that we need to see much wider opening of the market, and we don't see really deep agreement on very contentious issues having to do with the internet, with e-commerce, data localization, data storage, local subsidies to foreign investors, kind of a quid pro quo for technology. So there is a lot of issues that will remain on the table and can lead to further conflict.
Thanks for that. Yeah, when I was in China, cloud computing was the top one from European and US investors. And the industries of tomorrow, Zhang, as well. I mean, China is putting a lot of effort into robotics, pharmaceuticals, obviously 5G, which we hear a lot about. If there's not a deal, does this actually make China sort of move to self-sufficiency in these, or semi-self-sufficiency in the industries tomorrow more likely, because you're sort of breaking that codependence that we've seen for the last 40 years between the Chinese and US economies?
I want to follow Mary's comment first. I think the US-China trade talks are going to be a long process, and you won't see this deal to be including all these kind of things, because I think this deal is actually about a kind of executive deal with China based on this 301 kind of investigation. I think many talks should be held in the future. I think one day, and the two sides will be finally having a very good deal, and I hope a kind of FTA or BIT can be negotiated.
Free trade deal or a investment treaty.
Yes, and when it comes to this 5G and other high technology industries, I think China is having both the opening up process policy and also indigenous kind of investment. I think China is not hoping or expecting to finally decouple with American high technology field, but you never know. You never know if the Trump's government or even future administration will start to decouple with China on various industries. How can China do? China has to be better prepared and to have different alternatives.
Jeff, let's talk about that, because you're absolutely right, all of you, when you say that this trade deal doesn't mean everyone shakes hands on the economic issues between the US and China go away, do they? There are still conversations and big decisions to be had by both countries. Everyone talks in China about how the US spends too much money that it doesn't have. This wouldn't exist. Everyone here in the US talks about how subsidized Chinese key industries are. So there are lots of issues still remaining, whatever deal comes from this week, right?
Right, but if we go back to the text of the Section 301 complaint, it includes all of those industrial policies.
It does, yes.
The subsidies, forced technology transfer, all those things that are the toughest that are not really being addressed. It does not include purchases. I would also say that it is
that was the disconnect, isn't it? Because Donald Trump wanted to sell more stuff.
That's right.
Right? But Robert Lighthizer, the US Trade Representative, and Peter Navarro, who wrote that terrible book, Death by China, but they are very, very much about getting China to change, whereas the president is more about selling stuff, right?
Right. We're focusing on purchases because one person thinks that's very important. But the rest of the folks at the table think that it's the long-term industrial policy issues that are at the table. We were talking about whether technologically the countries are going to drift apart, and that would be very unfortunate because there really are fruitful areas of cooperation. I think artificial intelligence and 5G and some other areas do come to mind. However, there are strains in both countries that are pushing us apart. The China 2025 policy explicitly says China will become independent technologically and then exclude foreigners from the Chinese market, dominate that, and then do the same thing in the international market. And then you have folks in the administration, Peter Navarro and perhaps a few others, that want to do something similar. So really the political task, the leadership task here is to really find a way to move forward without disrupting the entire relationship, but to get to some really tough issues.
John, in Beijing, I want to follow up on that, because another thing about these trade talks is they seem to sort of, especially from the US side, ignore the sort of post-World War II sort of international financial architecture, especially if reports are true about the enforcement mechanisms which would allow the US unilaterally to snap back tariffs if they thought that China wasn't going along with the deal. The dispute mechanism is not going to be through the WTO. We know that for sure. So this is uncharted territory in a way, isn't it? And how does China feel about that, considering the rhetoric that we've heard, of course, from President Xi about multilateralism and the international community?
Well, China is still very much committed to defending the existing incumbent multilateral system, namely WTO and also IMF, these international institutions. But I think in reality, the government in China is coming to terms that between the relationship between the United States and China, it's going to be bilateral. Donald Trump has adopted this bilateral strategy with practically everyone. He doesn't want any new multilateral free trade agreements anymore. He specifically said that he prefers a negotiation on bilateral basis. So I think there are these things that will have to be addressed by the two sides. And he doesn't believe in taking things to the WTO. It takes a long time. It's not unfair to the United States. So this is a fact, and that both sides will have to realize too. But I also want to add a comment about the disparity between what the United States currently wants regarding the structural reforms and what's going in the current foreign investors law. We have to keep in mind that the lawmaking, National People's Congress in China is not in session all the time, unlike the U.S. Congress. And this piece of legislation is really sort of hurried through when the lawmakers are in session, I think back in January, right, early this year. Yeah. So this piece of legislation is really sort of hurried. And they need to reach some kind of a piece of a law.
We've got to give it time.
Anticipation of the agreements between US and China.
I know it hasn't been tested.
Yeah, so
we've got to give it time. John, sorry, time is short, and I want to get Mary in here as well because I want to also talk about the effect the last 10 months have had. Because basically we've been focusing on the negotiations, who wants what, but there's been real pain on both sides. We've seen the economic numbers out of China. I went to try and buy a washing machine the other day, a new one, and a fridge, and I could not believe that the prices were so steep. Maybe that's just me. But Mary, there have been some real economic costs. Washing machines, everything. Soybeans, prices at historic lows. What's been the effect on the US economy?
Well, I have looked closely at the effect on global supply chains, and these tariffs are very concentrated on a few industries. And they're clearly trying to hit multinational firm supply chains, particularly in things like computers and electronic devices and electronic machinery and transportation. So, this is a negative impact on American businesses. It leads us to be less competitive in our exports. So there has been pain. There's been pain in China, particularly in the factory areas, in the coasts. And so there are no winners. Anyone who thinks the U.S. is winning this trade war, I think, isn't being very realistic. I'd also like to say that I think longer term, this issue has to be multilateralized. There are too many ways for each side to avoid or go around so-called agreements. We live in a multilateral world, and the U.S. is going to have to cooperate with its partners to really achieve lasting reform in China.
Jeff, just quickly, like 30 seconds, what do you think has been the single most biggest impact of the last 10 months? And what should we bear in mind, even if this trade deal is done and we look at it in the rearview mirror?
Massive erosion of the rules-based trading system under the WTO that has really guided trade and has been improving lifestyles for everyone, and particularly the massive expansion of the national security exception, which should be narrowly tailored for true national security reasons, should not include things like cars.
Cars are not
and other things. This has been a problem with China overusing this exception, and now we are doing that. So
Europe, Japan,
we need to get back onto that multilateral system.
So I've run out of time, but I promise next time you're on the show, we'll give you the first and last word. Okay? I really appreciate all of that. A very stimulating discussion, and we will be following the trade talks if and when they happen all week here on CGTN America and of course on The Heat. But that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us. See you soon.